So thanks everyone for joining. It's really great to have you here and just to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. And today we'll be talking about embracing your legacy. Uh, so firstly, I just wanted to kick off to kind of set the tone a little bit because we're talking about legacy code and that can often mean different things to different people. And what I quite like is a definition by a gentleman called Eli Lopian, who's a CEO at a tech company, and he describes it as code that developers are afraid to change. And there's this typical consensus that you may have heard around that legacy code can be quite hard to work with. It often gets a bit of a kind of negative vibe. And part of that is there can sometimes be a lack of control around making change and a lack of a quick feedback loop that you might get from something like testing. But there are positives to legacy code too. I'm currently on a client, I've been on a client for the past year, which is an established, successful global brand. And they've been around for a number of years, into a few decades. And so understandably, they have code which is built on top of systems that are easily 10 to 15 years old. And that can make it tricky to work with, but also it's a testament to their success as a business that they've been around for that long and they have systems that have kind of carried them through that time. And whilst legacy isn't just about the age of the system, you can see that there's quite clear differences in dealing with code that has a bit of history behind it to code that you're going in and writing completely afresh. And at some point, if we are working in development, most of us will experience some system that has some history behind it and maybe long-lived systems. And so the aim of this talk is to explore what some of those challenges are, but to leave you with some tactics that you can walk in and use with your teams on Monday morning, and or you can keep in your pocket for any time you come across a system like this and are working with it. So just to set out what we're going to talk about, firstly, what we'll cover is we'll talk about some methodologies. So we'll start to talk about some kind of modern development practices that sit under the umbrella of Big A Agile, and we'll hone in specifically on what methodologies we're talking about. And then we will look at, when dealing with legacy code, what are some of the key challenges that we come across. And I've defined 3 areas of challenges, and you may or may not recognize some of these. Some of them may be new, but we'll talk a bit about what those are. And then we'll talk about some strategies which help make working with legacy code more manageable. So we'll think about some approaches that I've learned over the past year. First of all, touching on methodologies, Agile, as in Big A Agile, supports developing sustainable, high quality code and doing that in a way that is responsive and allows your development flow to respond to change. When I hear the word Agile, it brings up quite clear and easy imagery for me. And I've just brought in here some inspirations of mine, thinking of yoga practitioners and a lady who is a Cirque du Soleil member. And when we think about things like yoga or working with Cirque du Soleil, we can quite clearly see that it's more than just stretches and poses, but about having a strong core, about allowing for flexibility and the ability to change as needed. And practitioners get really quick indicators from their bodies when something doesn't feel good, and they have clear definitions for what success looks like for each pose that they're trying to achieve, and they make steady and slow progress towards achieving that. So in software development, Agile offers us a set of guiding principles which allow us to create robust, ready-to-go code with identifiable behaviors that we can easily adapt and that quickly informs us when something isn't quite right. And we try to keep that feedback loop quite tight so that we can adjust as necessary and that we can estimate the time it's going to take us to reach success. And so for the purpose of talk context, just to hone in on some of those methodologies, you may have heard of those such as Scrum or Kanban or KP mentioned in passing. And throughout all of those, there is a common theme of iterative development, which is supported by process, people, and practices. And all of those are born from a foundation of the Agile Manifesto, or at least try to align with the concepts within that. And teams uphold some of the values that are set out and the key principles for ways of working together. One extreme form of Agile is known as extreme programming, or XP. And that's detailed in books written by Kent Beck. And I have got a resource list to share at the end, which will allow for further reading around this. XP holds 5 core values around communication, simplicity, feedback, courage, and respect. And whilst the Agile Manifesto has 12 key principles, XP has 14 principles and practices. And those who follow XP to the letter are said to be practicing pure XP. So what do we do at 8th Light? At 8th Light, our practices are rooted in XP, but not strictly pure XP. We have a focus on 3 key areas that we feel allow us to write high quality, clean code and to identify and resolve problems quickly. The first focus of those is on test-driven development. And there are various kinds of tests, and I've included some information about like, the testing pyramid and looking at that. But these tests can start from the very building blocks of your code with unit tests for units of behavior in your system. The second area we look at is continuous delivery. And a simplistic distinction that we can make between continuous delivery and continuous deployment is that continuous delivery is manual and continuous deployment is automated. So your deployment process is continuous and it's an automated process. Martin Fowler actually mentions that he feels that continuous deployment actually requires continuous delivery. So at 8th Light, we aim for consistent incremental changes and regularly adding value as we make change to the system. And thirdly, as consultants, our focus is on the whole team around the system, not just the software development itself. So we take care to understand the business needs, the roles and concerns of those involved, and involve them in the process of successful change. So at this next point, we'll start to look at some of those challenge areas. And one of the first areas I've described here is challenges around code. And just to say a trigger warning, given sometimes a negative context, there may be some or many scenarios which are familiar and have been frustrating, but we'll talk about the challenges and then we'll talk about some strategies for improvements. So firstly, when looking at code, we tend to see quite a lot of technical debt. So here we have code that has been built quickly, but not necessarily for longevity. It potentially worked at the time it was built for the purpose that it was built for, and maybe still works now, but it's quite difficult to extend and it requires a lot more effort to rework. Secondly, we may have a lack of tests in that there are often little to no unit tests and more testing is done at the deployment stage. So a scenario that I've seen is that you have teams of developers who will work on a feature, they'll complete that and say that it's ready, and they might send that, say to QA it's ready to be tested, and QA will run regression tests, they'll run integration, they'll look at can this move into the system without causing disruption, and there might be something that fails and doesn't quite work. So it's sent back to devs and says, there's something here which still needs to be fixed and worked on. They make a change, it goes back to Q&A, and you can get this kind of back and forth because we don't have many unit tests to kind of test as we develop and see, or tests that help us test as we develop and see that things are working as they should before we get to the deployment stage. And secondly, we might have a multitude of tests which are slow to run. Sometimes there can be thousands of them, and they're not offering us very useful insights. They either don't respond to changes that we make, or it can be quite unclear what it is exactly that they're testing or what the expected behavior is. And then the third challenge within the code itself, it can be quite a flaky system. So we can have individual parts of the code base that are silently heavily dependent on one another. And we make a change in one part of the code base, and sometimes that change could be made by a completely different team. And that triggers an issue which either takes really significant time to understand what's happening and to fix it, or is near impossible to get to the bottom of. One example of this that I can give is when working on the client and cookie consent was introduced, or a new version of cookie consent was introduced across the system. And what we found was that there were certain of our pages that just weren't rendering in the right way. We had blank pages, and so users couldn't move through the system as they typically would, or you would move through the website as they typically would. And that took quite a lot of time to understand what it was about the implementation of the cookie consent that had interacted strangely with how our pages worked usually, and to find a way to fix that and make that possible to work. So what are some of the strategies? It can be quite difficult working with complex code, but there are also opportunities to make changes. And when dealing with complex code, the first most valuable lesson I learned is to be solution focused. So whilst you may have inherited a story or an area of the code base, or inherited this system, which is quite tricky to work with, you take ownership for that. This is our code now. How do we work on it and how do we improve it? And seek for solutions rather than focusing on the problems that exist and why. Secondly, to step back and realize that you can't fix everything straight away, but what you can do is always leave the code in a better shape than where you met it. So for that, I like to think not perfect, but better. And some quick wins here can be when you're building a new feature that you can somewhat isolate from how the system is working. You can introduce unit tests where possible around that specific feature. So as you're adding that, you can see that it's working as expected, and you can start to building some of that testing. Or if you are working on something where there's established code and you're noticing that there are improvements that can be made to the way that that's written, you can finish the feature or story that you're working on, and then you can, within that same branch that you've been working on, add a separate additional commit, which specifically focuses on the refactoring. And that can be a really great conversation starter to talk to teams about what improvements you made, why, how that's improved the system, and can be a model for others to look at about as to how the system can change and be improved. And the third area around code is that there can be this temptation to go straight in with, let's unit test everything, let's add tests everywhere and start to test our code. And code that's been built without tests, especially that is older and we don't have context for how it should behave, can be much harder to unit test. So it's actually better in terms of time and effort to add tests where is most valuable. What you can do is to start automating tests around your system. And a particular type of test that helps with this is characterization tests. With characterization tests, you look to understand what the key flows are through your system. What are the key things that your users would expect to be able to do? And what is point A and point B? This input, I expect this output, and the path through that. And you can start to add tests around that to look at what those happy paths are, group those and automatically run those tests as part of your pipeline, and make it possible to run those locally so that whilst you're developing, you can keep checking whether those flows are still working as expected. And as part of your pipeline, you can see that those are still uninterrupted as well. So the second area of challenges that I'd like to talk about is around the team, people and process. So a first issue we can see when we're dealing with legacy systems is that we can have isolated teams. So we can have teams that often build and solve for their product in isolation from other teams. And this could even be when there is some level of interaction between their respective systems. Secondly, we can have pockets of domain knowledge. So teams have a great deal of knowledge and context within their own domain or product, but at times this isn't shared across the business. And so there can be a bit of a lack of understanding for how these fit together in the whole. And that can be why we have some of these issues around development, because one product works really well as it is in its isolated bubble, but doesn't necessarily interact with how something else has been built in a completely different way. And the third thing there is around limited documentation. So knowledge that, or valuable knowledge, I should say, that isn't documented becomes lost. Teams can move on and the knowledge around their domain can go with them. It's not clear what the justification is for certain business decisions. And so any work that you might come in and do now that you've inherited this area of the code might require thorough research into what's even happening and why it's been built in that particular way in the first place. And so some strategies around that are firstly to open up communication. So trying to reduce this isolation by breaking down fences and finding ways of working together and ways of sharing knowledge and information. Some really quick wins here are having stand-ups, which most teams will probably have, making sure that those are kept succinct and we have a good view of what everyone's working on, as well as having retros, so that as a team, we can talk about what some of the challenges are and what hasn't worked, and we can get context for the different concerns of different individuals within the team and what their respective responsibilities are. An example of this opening up of communication that I can give is when working on introducing Apple Pay, which was quite a significant feature within the client. That flow of the system involved making calls to both to internal APIs that had been built and maintained by other teams, as well as using Apple's system for how Apple Pay should be handled. And what we did there as a team was we actually set up twice weekly calls with the relevant stakeholders, including QA, including product management, including those who were responsible for that area of the business, to discuss progress, to note any blockers that we might have, and to ask questions which helped us to better understand what needed to be done next. And so that moved what could have taken months or many, many months of back and forth. You know, we're sending this data over to this, we're making this call to the API and we're getting back this response to say something's misshapen about what we've sent. We can talk to that team and find out from them what they're seeing on their side and what they would expect and make those changes quite quickly. And that meant that we had this contained, steady movement as a team within a few months to be able to, well, a few weeks to months to be able to successfully roll out this feature across all markets and be sure that it was really going to work as we expected to when we were ready to roll it out. Secondly is empowering your teams. So I talked about teams being isolated from other areas of the business or even from different roles. And they, as an example of a team that I worked in, there was often for me an apprehension when a new quite complex bug came in, where we hadn't necessarily made any changes to our part of the system, but something had changed somewhere else. And now we had a bug where there was an urgency for us to report back what was happening and to fix it as soon as possible. But there wasn't really an opportunity for a quick answer because we had to first understand what had even happened, why this had arisen. And as an example, we started to, for really complex but quite urgent bugs, to set up a call quite quickly to understand from the person reporting what was the behavior that they expected and what was the behavior that they saw. Whether it was possible for us to replicate, because at times when we tried to replicate that from our own machines or in a development environment, we couldn't see the bug in the same way that we could see it on production. So it made it hard to break down what was going on. We could talk about how big the impact was, how many users was this having an impact for, and then move together towards an evaluation of the best next steps. So that removed some of our worry about needing to fix this quickly or frustration in not being able to find out exactly what was happening. And as a team decide, okay, how much impact is this having? Do we want to spend the time it's going to take us to dig into this deeper and to get comfortable saying, no, this is something that we won't fix. It's having a very low impact. It's not happening very often compared to, okay, yes, this is something we're definitely going to take the time to investigate and find out exactly what we need to do here to make that work as we expect it to. So that empowered the team to make that decision together. And then thirdly, with the team, documenting valuable discoveries. So when investigating what might be happening or working through a system and getting really detailed understanding of how this system works, it can be a temptation to think of that if we haven't fixed a bug that we were investigating, but we understand now something more about the system, for that to feel potentially like wasted time, but actually shifting that language to looking at it as opportunities for understanding and using what we'd learned as a way to document discoveries and make that accessible across the team so that within the team, we could save some of that time by referring to this document that we had, and later on that other team members could look back and get a quick understanding of, okay, this is actually the expected behavior flow through this particular area. And so again, looking at ways to document the discoveries you do make as you investigate your legacy system. And then the third area we have is around allies. So the first area there is around resistance to change. When you are coming into a space where there have been quite established ways of working for quite a while, and we're now, wanting to introduce change and make improvements, there can be team members who have very comfortable ways of working. When we want to make improvements and shift, just bringing in something new can ignite confusion and it can challenge trust. And so it can be difficult to work together and get everybody on board around how we make these changes and how we want to, the new processes we want to have as a team. And the second area is a need for clear, visible progress. So talking about these different responsibilities, especially those who might be in product management, who may seem more visible to the business or commit to the delivery of certain new features, they need to be able to report on what's happening and want clear, visible progress in the desired direction. But they may not be as into the detail of what the challenges are and the complexity of the code that is impacting on the time it might take us to get to that successful delivery. And so that can be a challenging area as well in terms of communication and how they're brought into how they're brought into what's happening and when we can deliver what we're working on. And so some of the strategies there is firstly around asking leading questions. So when we have meetings such as retros and relevant meetings, it's important to empower individuals to get their thoughts out, to explain the pros and cons to approaches that we might want to take in reaching a decision together. So rather than implementing and enforcing change, we're making that movement together as a team. And some really great ways to do that in terms of language and communication is, rather than saying things like, that's not right, that's not going to work, we can ask leading questions such as, what would happen if this thing, or how do we handle for this particular case? As those can be really great non-confrontational ways to talk about what some of the problems and concerns are, but to facilitate conversation around them so we can decide on the changes we want to make together as a team and why those would be beneficial. Secondly, improved visibility. So making it clear to those who may not have as much visibility of the challenges of the development itself, giving them the right information to help them to communicate that message back to other parts of the business and to also work together to find solutions. So an example that I can give here is when being challenged on how long it might take to finish a particular feature. But with the difficulty that there was a bit of ambiguity around what the definition of done looked like, what we were trying to achieve, when, and for who. Dealing with the question of, okay, so when are we going to have this finished? A great way to open up that conversation, and actually some advice that was given to me by my manager at the time was giving a larger estimate. So saying to them, okay, well, this could take us anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months because of this. It could take us 2 weeks if we're able to hit this, this, and this pretty quickly, but it could take us 2 months because we don't have X information, and so we're doing this quite blindly. We don't know when this is going to come into effect, so we can't plan for that time. And that then incentivizes others to help find those answers, to get to those solutions quite quickly, and to break the problem down into smaller chunks that we can clearly define, and we can be sure, yes, we're going to deliver this part of it at this point, and then we'll work on the next stage. So it's a great way to facilitate allies to help improve how things are going. And then the third, still around estimates and expectations, are great tools. If you're not already using them, is around using things like PERT estimates, where you talk about this is an optimistic timeline for this piece of work to be done, this is a realistic timeline, and then this is a pessimistic one. But by doing so and giving those 3 different estimates, you can talk about quite early on before starting the work, what could go really well, what might make it take a little bit longer, and what could go really badly. And so by talking through those hurdles first, everyone's prepared, and it can reduce the surprise if you do hit on one of those more complex issues that makes it take a bit longer. You've communicated that early on, and allies kind of have an understanding for why that's taking a bit longer than expected. So that was quite a bit that we covered in terms of those 3 areas of challenge and some strategies around them. And now we'll just do a recap of what we've discussed around embracing legacy code. So firstly, we talked about what some approaches are within Agile and Agile methodologies. And we touched on the fact that the approaches I was going to talk about were rooted in XP, but not pure XP. And secondly, we explained what some of those challenge areas are within legacy code. And we talked about 3 key pillars of that, one being the complexity of the code itself, second being around teams, isolated development and isolated views of how things work together across the whole system and business, and third about getting buy-in from allies and then having visibility of what some of those challenges are and how we can move towards success in the best way possible. And so then we looked at the strategies for each of those challenge areas. And what I've done here is just made a quick slide that I will pause on for a moment if you do want to take a screenshot, but is also included in the resources that I will share after this. And these few areas are some of the things that have been impactful for me over the past year as I've learned, and maybe they could work for you and your team too, or you might have additional suggestions that you've tried that have really worked in your teams. And so just the last thing that I want to leave you with, which always sticks with me as an apprentice when I was coding in a functional language for the very first time after working in object-oriented ones, I kind of hit a wall and felt like this was the thing that was going to break me and like I was fighting against my code. And one thing that my mentor said to me at the time is, this is software, not hardware, which has always stayed with me. And so I wanted to mention that with legacy code, though it can be hard, it can require more effort. It's not impossible. It is software, and there are ways to work through it. And so now I open the space for any questions, and there's also a link to the resources from today's talk.